Chris Burns, and welcome to The Network, where we connect into a matrix of newsmakers to get to the heart of an issue. And watch out, they've got to answer in 25 seconds or less, or else. Let's take a look at that issue right now. Cyber wars can translate into real tensions, as in the case of a former U.S. intelligence analyst who leaked large amounts of information. Tensions have risen between China and the U.S. as they exchange accusations of hacking. And many Europeans are also angry and nervous about the so-called PRISM scandal, which the U.S. government obtained online data from leading internet firms. European lawmakers say PRISM has thrown into question the ongoing overhaul of 20-year-old EU data protection rules and existing transatlantic data sharing deals. They include the SWIFT agreement on sharing financial transaction data and an agreement on airline passenger name records. Industrial espionage, terrorism, organized crime, all reasons governments use to tap into the internet to track down the bad guys. Without a data agreement, does that leave it up to covert exchange of data anyway to avert another terrorist attack? Now, wired into this edition of The Network is, in Hamburg, Jan-Philipp Albrecht. He's a Greens member of the European Parliament's Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs Committee and author of the Parliament's draft position on data protection. In Cambridge, Ian Walden, Professor of Information and Communications Law at the University of London. He's a critic of government surveillance like PRISM. And here at the European Parliament in Brussels is John Higgins, General Director of Digital Europe, which represents digital technology firms large and small across Europe. A question to all of you, starting with Jan Philipp, is how much has PRISM damaged the trust between governments and the public? Jan Philipp.
There has been a significant damage to trust with this program PRISM, but also with the program Tempora by the British intelligence service. And I think that it's now up to politicians to restore that trust, especially of European citizens here in Europe. So we need to ensure that we negotiate agreements with third states about data transfers and data protection rules, and that we also enforce our own rules here in Europe so that they are really applied. Okay.
Ian, how much damage do we see?
I think in terms of trust between governments, probably not that much, because I think many governments will be aware of such practices. I think the public is going to completely distrust now some of the assurances that government gives that they're not listening into our communications.
Okay, John, what about you? And also between businesses, perhaps, too, right?
Well, Chris, I try and look at things from the perspective of the economic and social challenges facing Europe at the moment. And you know, with well over half of the young people in Spain out of work, and the best chance of getting them jobs is the burgeoning digital economy in Europe. I think the fact that this has eroded trust in sort of all things digital is bad news. And I agree with Jan Philipp that politicians have got to work hard to re-establish that trust.
Okay, and on a government-to-government level, what about this EU-US data protection agreement that's gone down in flames repeatedly in front of the European Parliament? They voted it down. What are the chances now of such an agreement in light of PRISM? Jan Philipp.
It's a pity that we are not coming forward with an agreement, with such an agreement, because there's not much political will to install changes in legislation, for example, for protection of EU citizens in US law, for redress possibilities. That would be necessary. And of course, we need to have a regulation here in Europe which really gets one single standard on a high level and gives then trust to the digital market in Europe.
Okay, Ian, how much does this does PRISM complicate and of course Tempora complicate those talks for a data protection agreement?
Oh, clearly it's going to have an impact. I think it's widely recognised, even by the US, that they're going to have to move some way down the line to having some sort of general data protection regime that's more akin to the European regime. But at the same time, this is a transfer agreement that is trying to catch up with reality, because clearly there is huge amounts of ongoing transfers between Europe and the US anyway. So it is simply trying to put a legal wrap around what already exists.
Well, yeah, maybe I'll spin it a little bit differently for you. John, isn't PRISM or things like that necessary because there's no data protection agreement?
Well, I think it's worth unpicking PRISM and the discussion about data protection in Europe. We've got to remember that all democracies are expected by their people to do what they need to do to provide them with security. But we also need data protection rules that encourage citizens to trust in data in cyberspace, and at the same time encourage companies to come to the marketplace.
Yes, exactly. Jan Philipp, what about this aspect of how restrictive surveillance should be without the risk of letting the bad guys get away? I mean, how do you balance that?
I mean, we had a problem throughout the last 10, 15 years that we focused very much on preventive action by collecting masses of personal data of all citizens out there, instead of concentrating on the information exchange with suspicious people in real cases of law enforcement and security measures which are focused on the risks we already have. And that needs to be done now. We need to use the data we have instead of massively surveying our citizens. That's not compatible with the rule of law-based democracy.
Ian, is it the fishing expedition problem? Or, I mean, governments, at least the U.S. government, has insisted that it is only asking a tiny, tiny fraction of this information from Internet companies. What's the problem here?
I think we still don't know the complete scope of PRISM and how much law enforcement were getting automated full access to data being generated by these companies. But clearly there are legal rules in place for individual investigations. What seems very unclear is to what extent governments have given law enforcement the power to actually get access to the hosepipe, essentially suck in everything in order to investigate. And that's the greatest area of concern and the need for transparency.
Okay, John, let's turn to this proposed data protection legislation here at the European Parliament. How much does PRISM and Tempora complicate this process to get a data protection agreement, hopefully by next year?
We need to keep clear in our minds the distinction between the two things. So the things that Ian was saying about we need to understand how governments access our personal data, and we need to ensure that that's done within the laws that we find acceptable to different societies. But that's different from a data protection regulation that is primarily designed to ensure citizens' trust in the marketplace and encourage companies to go and operate in that marketplace to offer services, ideally in a harmonised way across Europe.
Okay, how do we do that, Jan Philipp, in light of PRISM and the fact that you said nearly 4,000 amendments that you got to sort out through this for this data protection agreement, data protection legislation?
I don't agree on the issue that there is a clear distinction between personal data given to communication systems or to providers which are private companies on the one side, and on the other side the surveillance and privacy intrusion by state institutions, because you cannot distinguish between both anymore. After PRISM and Tempora, this is more than clear. It's about the huge amount of personal data around and the question, how much control do we have as individual citizens and consumers on our personal information? Okay,
Ian, very, very quickly, should the right to be forgotten, that's a very important aspect of this data protection legislation, how much of a burden, I mean, how much should that be sacred, and how much of a burden is that on business?
I think the concept of the right to be forgotten is very problematic. The extent to which the right to be forgotten should be carried out by third parties such as Google is highly questionable, and therefore I think too much focus has been placed on that aspect to the detriment of the legislation as a whole.
Thanks very much, gentlemen. I'm sorry we're out of time. I'd like to thank all of our guests, Jan Philipp Albrecht, Ian Walden, and John Higgins. I'm Chris Burns, and until next time, thanks for connecting with The Network.